Okay, welcome guys. Before we get totally started, I just want to mention that we are going to be taking questions at the end of our talk here from Kelsey. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to them at the end. So, I mean, feel free to put them in throughout, but we will take them maybe in the last 15 or 10 minutes or so. But other than that, this is Kelsey. Kelsey is a National Park Service ranger, and we're going to be learning about the William Floyd Estate tonight. Thank you for being here, Kelsey.
Yeah, no problem. It's a pleasure. The William Floyd Estate is a really cool place. It's one of several visitor sites that you can go to that's within the boundaries of Fire Island National Seashore. So it's a little bit complicated. I work for Fire Island National Seashore, and I work at the William Floyd Estate. That's part of my duties, even though the William Floyd Estate isn't actually on Fire Island. So the estate is managed by the National Park Service and managed by Fire Island National Seashore, but it's kind of separate in many ways. Still, the connections are there. It has this very, throughout its history, from its pre-colonial history all the way up into the 1960s, the William Floyd Estate had these very close ties to Fire Island. And so we try to elevate those ties as we talk. But so yeah, today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the history. We're going to be exploring the William Floyd Estate together. As you guys might imagine, the actual history of the William Floyd Estate is really, really long, really broad, right? So the family that is that has been the focus of things at the William Floyd Estate for a long time. They occupied the William Floyd Estate from 1724 all the way up into the 1960s. So there's just this huge swath of history at the William Floyd Estate, and we really can't, we don't have time to talk about it all. But I really thought it would be interesting today to focus really on the pre-colonial history and up until independence, right? Because the William Floyd Estate, of course, is named after William Floyd, one of many things that are named after William Floyd. William Floyd Parkway, William Floyd High School, William Floyd Middle School, school district, everywhere, in the Mastic Shirley area you go, you're going to see something named after William Floyd. Well, I should introduce myself. My name is Kelsey before I go any further. And I'm a park ranger. I've been working on Fire Island now for 10 years and at the William Floyd Estate too. I actually grew up in the Tri-Hamlet area. So I'm from Mastic Beach. I actually went to William Floyd High School. The name William Floyd has sort of been floating around in my head for a long, long time. So yeah, that's just a little introduction to who I am. And, when we talk about William Floyd and the William Floyd Estate, though, I really do like to say that William Floyd is really the tip of the iceberg as far as the history goes, the history that we have in the Mastic Shirley area. It's really rich and an abundant place if you want to learn about all of these different parts of American history. And it's, and you can really explore and experience a lot of that just from the William Floyd Estate. The William Floyd Estate, for those who don't already know, let me try to get a little laser pointer, see if I can get that going, is situated on Long Island, right? This is where we are. You guys are coming in from East Hampton, the East Hampton Library, one of the older settlements on Long Island out in the Hamptons. The William Floyd Estate is tucked in right over here. It's actually kind of funny. You look at the satellite photo and you can almost see it, right? It's this little splotch of green and almost looks like an open field here compared to the rest of Long Island, especially if you look further west. You can see how densely populated Long Island is, right? There are suburbs and neighborhoods all over. So this is a slightly closer look at Mastic Beach, Mastic, Shirley, Mauritius, right? This right here is Forge River. Forge River is a really important waterway on Long Island and actually has its own really rich history. The way that the people in the area, whether they were pre-colonial Native Americans or even contemporary, people interact with this river is really remarkable. The William Floyd Estate is really situated near the mouth of this river. Today, we can see it right over here. That's this green splotch here. There's some marshes in a lower acreage. There's a pretty dense forest. And then the William Floyd Estate, the old Mastic house that folks are familiar with, is right in this area. Of course, to the south of the William Floyd Estate We have Fire Island over here. We have the Fire Island Breach, which some of you might have heard about. Mauritius Inlet on this side, right? And this is all happening right in the middle of Mastic Beach, really in the heart of Mastic Beach. Now, the William Floyd Estate has changed a lot over time. When William Floyd and his family owned the estate during the colonial period, it extended a whole mile across and 7 miles north, all the way up to right around where the Brookhaven National Laboratory is. Slowly over time, the family sold off bits and pieces of that land, and it became a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller. The 1950s saw this huge boom in development, especially on within suburban Long Island. And so eventually little bits and pieces of it were chipped away until what remains as the William Floyd Estate is around 413 acres. And that's going to be this over here. This is a slightly closer view, just to give you guys an idea. The old Mastic house is right here. We have a public parking lot over here for anyone who needs to use public bathrooms or picnic tables. This is a really nice area to go. This is sort of the entryway to the William Floyd Estate. There is a boardwalk trail that will lead you to the main lawn where you can see the old Mastic house. You can walk down a trail to the family cemetery. You can walk down some of these trails down into what we call the lower acreage. Some of the coolest hiking trails we have on Long Island. I would warn you, they can be pretty rough when it comes to ticks and mosquitoes. I really think that hiking is best after a couple of nice frosts. So we're usually open up until at least Veterans Day, but it's quite possible we'll be open until like Thanksgiving this year. I haven't gotten confirmation on that yet. But for anyone looking to go for a really nice hike, honestly, like beginning of November is a great time. Exploring the lower acreage is really exciting. You have a good chance of seeing a huge variety of different wild animals. We get turtles at the estate. We get birds at the estate. There's a nesting pair of bald eagles that we get out in there, and it's quite it's pretty common to see their children come by. We also see osprey, we see egrets, we see herring, we see a huge variety of different animals. Turkey, pretty much every morning I'm out there, I see turkey across the field. And then of course we do have a lot of deer here as well. So this is a really rich natural area, right? There's a lot of resource for us to both enjoy and to take advantage of. Fishing out here is great. Clamming out here on the marshes can be really good. Mussels and oysters are all harvested from this area. I just want to point out a few other things. We have Home Creek right here. Home Creek kind of runs up along the eastern side of the estate and tapers off right around where the family cemetery is. And that sort of frames the modern boundary of the estate. But of course, the estate back when the Floyds lived here would have also extended out around what we know today as Osprey Point. So it's a really cool, really dynamic area. And it's very large too, so there's a lot to explore. Today, the landscape of the estate is actually very different from what it would have been during William Floyd's time here. If we observe the natural spaces around the property, today you'll see a lot of dense thickets, these sort of scrubby forests that feature mainly like softwood trees. A lot of times you'll see pines. We do see the wild animals I mentioned earlier. We'll also see foxes and snakes and groundhogs. If you were visiting during the colonial period, though, these scrubby little forests that you're going to see today, these wouldn't have really been around, right? You would have seen one of two things. You would have either seen dense, somewhat old growth forests that would have featured more hardwood trees, less things like pines, more things like oaks, or you would have seen open agricultural fields, and they would have been framed by those denser forests, right? Before those fields, those fields were, used by the family to grow everything from oats to barley, wheat, corn. And so the landscape here has changed quite a bit over time. The land it's good to sort of familiarize yourself, I'm sure, and I apologize if I'm going over anything you guys already know. But the land that we know today as Long Island and the William Floyd Estate sort of formed a long time ago. pretty much after the end of the last ice age, right? As glaciers melted, or as great glaciers froze, they actually ran through the mountains up north from where we are now, whether it's the Adirondacks or the Catskills. As those glaciers moved through those mountains, they would have taken that material and ground it up into fine sediment and rocks, right? As those glaciers receded, they would have left behind that material. Oftentimes you see heavier, larger rocks on the North Shore versus the South Shore. Places like the William Floyd Estate tend to have much sandier, much more clay-filled soil. And that's because you can imagine as those glaciers melting, the heavier materials were sort of deposited closer to the edge of the glacier along what we call terminal moraines. There are two of them on Long Island, and you could sort of almost see them as the forks in a way. Right, and then all of the lighter materials were pulled out with water even further along, and that's why on the South Shore we get this really sandy soil. That sandier material has its advantages. The clay and the sand together, along with soil that was allowed to develop after the end of the last ice age, made for pretty good farming here on the South Shore of Long Island. And that farming would be a real engine for the William Floyd Estate for many, many years. Of course, William Floyd wasn't the first person. His family weren't the first people to visit the William Floyd Estate. While we're not exactly sure when the first people arrived at William Floyd Estate, it was likely that Paleo-Americans, people who we know today as Native Americans, arrived on Long Island sometime after the end of the last ice age. If you take a look at this map of human migration across the Bering Land Bridge, right? You might be familiar with this already, but when we had glaciers, right, sea levels were much lower because a lot of the sea was contained in those walls of ice. And so with lower sea levels, there was likely a land connection between Asia and North America. This would have been a major migratory route for Paleo-Americans as they crossed what's called the Bering Land Bridge, right? They would have actually followed down into North America, pretty much following in this area. A lot of the Paleo-Americans would have been following the edges of glaciers that we saw just a moment ago. So you can see the glacial ice sheet here, and you can see a rough map of human migration here. It would have been following huge resources, you know, this bountiful resource that we see even today on Long Island. Everything from deer to clams. Clams are very important for the native people on Long Island. This clam here is a hard-shell clam, also called the quahog clam. And it's really special because, I mean, it's a great food. A lot of people really love eating quahog clam. Quahogs are very useful. We could eat them, very tasty. I'm vegetarian. I haven't been frequently, but I've been told they're great. Other than the abundant meat inside of these things, they're very useful. Native American tribes, including the Shinnecock and the Unkachog, used to take these, and still do actually, take these clams, crack them open, use the shells to produce beads. You'd use, in particular, the sort of purple that you get on the rims of these shells to make things like, to make beads that you can actually use to make beautiful pieces of, you know, oftentimes belts were constructed or pieces of jewelry, and that was called wampum, right? So this was a very important resource. Wampum actually factored very significantly into the economy, both here on Long Island and also all the way up into New York State and up and down the East Coast. The further you were away from the ocean, sometimes the more valuable the wampum could be because it was sort of harder to come across. But so this is a very valuable and important resource. Of course, we have things like striped bass. The fishing around here is really great. The earliest people to be visiting would have been fishing. They would have been gathering things like striped bass, things that people still fish for today. And then, of course, we also have a lot of whales. I think we've been really fortunate in the last few years off the coast of Fire Island to see a lot of whales. People from the pre-colonial period all the way up through the colonial period and into the, you know, early years of the United States actually hunted whale. Whale was a really important source of food, a really important industry in the early United States. And it was like, you know, it was one of Long Island's really abundant resources, something that was really important something that really factored into the lives of everyday people. The Unkachog Nation, I just mentioned a moment ago, are actually very famous whalers. They were known at their time as very skilled whalers. They sort of helped to inform other people as they were just learning the practice of whaling. The Unkachog Nation, of course, still exists today. It's actually one of the, it's actually, I want to say it might be the oldest recognized Native American reservation at a spot called Puspatak. Not federally recognized, but recognized by New York State. If it's not the oldest, then it's certainly among the oldest. It was first recognized in 1659 by the state of New York after European colonists started to settle on the land. The European settlers sort of come in a variety of, in different waves, right? And they were interacting with Unkachog people. They would have also been interacting with people across Long Island. People have been here for a very long time, learning how to use the resources, learning really how to live off of the land. The area that today is, we know as the William Floyd Estate, would have been on Unkachog land. It was very important to them. It still is today. The first Europeans to start settling on Long Island would have been Dutch, oftentimes on the west end of Long Island, settling in New York City and in the area around New York City. You also had later waves of English settlers in places like, the Hamptons. Many of these settlers actually would have been coming down not from England directly, but they would have been coming down from New England, from places like Massachusetts, places like Rhode Island, places like Connecticut. And that's sort of going to be a little bit of the history of William Floyd and his family. They sort of came in from Massachusetts. But the land that we know today as the William Floyd Estate was originally deeded by the King of England to a gentleman named Colonel William Tangier Smith and his family in 1696, which is pretty late if you consider places like, Puritan America in Massachusetts and New England. These were manors that were set up, most of them in New York State, by the King of England across like his holdings in colonial America. They thought at the time that the best way to sort of manage the land would be to try to sort of reproduce this sort of manor lifestyle that you had back in England, where you would have these manors granted to aristocratic people, oftentimes the brothers of the people who were inheriting the family fortune, the land, the manor back at home, right? So these were people who were aristocratic and powerful, but also people who weren't like the first in line for inheritance. And so these manors were created, 23 of them across colonial America, and granted by the King of England to people like Colonel William Tangier Smith. He basically said, this is a plot of land, this is yours, you own this. Of course, that dispossessed Native Americans in the area of their lands. It also sort of, made for all sorts of challenges in the early colonial period as people were trying to settle on those lands. They thought that these manors would reproduce a lifestyle that existed in colonial England. They thought that the aristocrat, the person in charge of the manor, would bring in a lot of people to sort of act as peasants, to sort of act as his servants. Slavery later on would eventually become a very important part of that process, trying to reproduce that aristocratic lifestyle. But these manors also sort of like the idea of these manors, reproducing that old world lifestyle, sort of failed very quickly. As people started to realize, people coming in from Europe, people who weren't wealthy aristocratic landowners, but talking about merchants, even talking about peasants and people who didn't have money, who were still immigrating to the New World. They realized, well, there was so much land here, there was so much land here that was actively being taken, actively being colonized, that it didn't make any sense to go and move on to this guy's manor. Most of the people sort of started to settle on the outskirts of these manors. And so these manors didn't have the kind of influence that a lot of people expected, that was really expected by the King of England when he established these manors. Instead, these manors became machines for the accruing of wealth through the selling of small parcels of land, right? So whereas they thought a manor could be productive for farmland and things like that, that could be the real engine of the economy. The engine of the early colonial economy here on Long Island became like these landowners, these people who were deeded this land, selling it off to other people. That's how the money sort of started to come in. And so you start to see a lot of European settlers coming in, a lot of colonists sort of taking over lands through a series of contracts and things like that. So the land that is the William Floyd Estate was actually originally deeded to the Unkechaug Nation in perpetuity as part of an agreement between William Tangier Smith and the Unkechaug people. He later completely ignored that agreement and sold the land to, the Smiths sold the land to Richard Floyd II, who was the first Floyd who sort of comes into the picture. So I think that's a really important thing to mention. It's really telling about how Long Island was sort of colonized over time, the way these contracts were written, rewritten, they were broken, and oftentimes in a way that really disadvantaged Native American Long Islanders and actively, broke up their land. So Richard Floyd II is the first Floyd we're talking about today. He was born in 1661. He was the son of Richard Floyd I, who had immigrated from Brecknockshire, Wales. It wasn't uncommon for like Welsh and Scottish settlers to move to the New World in search of land that they could own in these aristocratic manors. Many of the earliest European settlers were among, the younger members of the family, as I mentioned. They were people who were not going to have access to the family's main inheritance and who wanted more. They wanted to expand either through, accruing land or investing in mercantilism. Richard Floyd was a relatively wealthy landowner. He spent most of his time on Long Island, but prior to his time on Long Island, he actually spent some time in Barbados and later in New England and Massachusetts before eventually coming down to Long Island, first settling on the North Shore closer to Huntington. That's where he first appears in our records in the late 1660s. It's possible he might have been here earlier. I do think it's really notable to mention that he did actually originally come from Long Island from Massachusetts, and then he had come from Massachusetts from Barbados. Barbados was this really important colony. Of course, it was very famous for the brutal style of slavery that developed around there. And it's possible that Richard Floyd learned about slavery, Richard Floyd II learned about slavery from his time in Barbados, and that would eventually be inherited by the family. So he came to Massachusetts, then he came down to the North Shore of Huntington in the late 1660s. From the early days, the Floyd family worked to establish these profitable estates, right? They were actively dispossessing native Long Islanders of their land, and then eventually taking some of that money that they were gaining and reinvesting that into a variety of other industries, agriculture. Whaling was, like I mentioned before, a really important industry. So in 1724, Richard Floyd II's son, Nicol Floyd, built the first portion of what we know today as the old Mastic House. That's this building here. That's the Manor House that we usually take people on tours of. It's actually, the old Mastic House is closed right now for some significant renovations. We're doing work on the collection in the interior, basically cleaning and recataloging everything. But so the original section of this house would have been right here, pretty much in the center. This here, it was very modest at the time. Over time, wings were added to the house. Today it's quite large. We have of course, we have an eastern wing here. There are north wings on the opposite side, a northeastern and a northwestern wing. There was actually a whole eastern wing as well. So it was quite a large house, but the first portion, like I mentioned, was put in 1724 by Richard Floyd II. Sorry. When he was settling in this area, Nickel Floyd, the son of Richard Floyd II, they were starting to establish a profitable plantation. They grew corn, wheat, flax, oat, other crops. They also raised cattle. They raised pigs, sheep, ducks. We think sort of later on in the history of this farm that cattle and cattle like sheep, pigs, cows, and things like that were actually more important to the economy than things like flax, oat, and wheat, and that oftentimes those things were probably grown to supplement the farm. But so we start to see this sprawling estate forming, this major plantation, right? And that plantation was mainly worked on by employed Unkachog and also indentured servants who were coming over, often with a massive amount of debt from Europe, as well as enslaved Africans. So this is William Floyd. This is the name that we're all probably very familiar with, the namesake of the William Floyd Estate. William Floyd was really young when he inherited the William Floyd Estate from his father. Nickel Floyd passed away suddenly in 1755. He was just 20 years old at the time, and so suddenly William Floyd, this 20-year-old guy, became one of Long Island's most prominent landowners, right? He was one of the wealthiest, one of the most significant landowners we had on Long Island. Along with the 4,400 acres of land, all of the business contracts that his father had, William Floyd also inherited several slaves who continued to work the land. At the height of the estate, William Floyd was one of Long Island's largest slaveholders. He might have held at least 20 people in slavery. That changes quite a bit throughout his lifetime. Later on in his life, it was fewer. And oftentimes, people came and went. There was a lot of movement. Throughout his life, William Floyd proved himself to be a pretty competent statesman. He was a politician. He was also a businessman. In 1770, he received a colonel's commission in the Suffolk County Militia, which is important, right? Because when we think about the war for independence, oftentimes the sort of what would become the military of the colonies of the early United States really came from these militias. So in Suffolk County, William Floyd was a colonel. He had a significant role in managing this militia, in raising this militia. He was also elected representative to the First and Second Continental Congress in 1774, right? So just 2 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, William Floyd was representing New York State at the Continental Congresses. Most famously, of course, William Floyd became one of just 4 signers of the Declaration of Independence when he signed it in 1776. Very quickly, this set off a huge chain of events. From the beginning, the European colonists were really championing a sense of independence and freedom, despite, of course, holding other people in the bondage of slavery. Richard Floyd II's son, Richard Floyd III, along with his son, were actually charged and arrested in 1766, 10 years before the American Revolution, on charges of sedition. Richard Floyd II was able to pay to get his son and his grandson out of jail, Richard Floyd III. So when William Floyd signed the Declaration of Independence, he knew he was, of course, risking his life. He was risking his property. He was risking this estate, all for this promise of independence, breaking away from the King of England. Long Islanders at the time were generally fairly hesitant to support any colonial uprising against the king. There were a lot of loyalists, including many of William Floyd's neighbors, people who didn't want to see independence, who didn't want to break away from England. The American Revolution quickly kicked off after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. You saw British forces moving into occupy New York. New York was a major site for the American Revolution as the British tried to cut off these supply lines between the agricultural southern colonies and the slightly more industrial, but certainly more mercantile northern colonies of Massachusetts, right? So New York became this really important site, a place where they can actually break through that line and break all of those connections. So it wasn't long before British vessels were present actually within the Great South Bay. One of my fun facts is that Old Inlet, that place where the breach occurred on Fire Island, I mentioned a little while before. That actually is called Old Inlet because there was an historical inlet, not in that spot, but very close to that spot. British ships actually moved through Old Inlet to seize the Manor of St. George. So that's the manor we were talking about before. The Smith family owned. The Smith family was selling off bits of that land, and one of those bits became the William Floyd Estate, right? So the British, when they came through, they seized one of the largest plot of lands by seizing the Manor of St. George. There was a very small battle that was fought to wrest control from it, but these Suffolk County Patriots, these colonial militias, were forced to retreat and to sort of start to disappear, right? Redcoats from that point actually marched down what we know today as Neighborhood Road. If you're going to the William Floyd Estate, this is one of the main access routes. Your GPS might take you on a weird, crazy route to get there, but this is one of the main roads. This is actually a road that I grew up on as I lived in Mastic Beach. So it's still an important road today, and I just think it's really neat to know that that road has such a long history. So the British did march down that road. But at that point, William Floyd and his family were already fleeing. As soon as he signed the Declaration of Independence, he came back to Long Island. He knew that it was going to be very dangerous for his family to stay there. So they already started to flee up into New England, where they became refugees, mostly in Connecticut, right? There's a little bit of colonial history for you. Like there's apparently a huge influx of Long Island refugees, these transplants, these patriots who were fleeing because, of course, Long Island was a British stronghold throughout much of the American Revolution. So British forces soon pushed back all of those Suffolk County and Nassau County colonial militias back into New York, right? You had this really decisive victory at the Battle of Bald Hill. And then, of course, the Battle of Fort Washington really helped to solidify the fact that Long Island was a loyalist stronghold over the course of the war. Despite that, of course, there were still people who were sympathetic to the Patriots, to the American Revolutionaries. They would have been organized, oftentimes sabotaging British troop movements, and also spying. Spying was a really important thing here on Long Island because so much of the British leadership stayed out here. People would keep their ears open, and they would pass information on that would sort of lead later on in the war. One account reported that actually when William Floyd left, him and his family fled. Everyone except for one gentleman by the name of Steve actually stayed behind. It was one of William Floyd's enslaved workers who lived on the property, and he was entrusted by the family to keep an eye on the British, and basically not to stop them, not to keep the estate managed, but really just to report back on what they were doing on the property. So when he signed the Declaration of Independence, William Floyd really marked his name into history books. That's why everything around here is named after William Floyd today. But he also did so with the support of so many people. His wife and children were obviously important supporters. They would have been providing active labor. They would have also been advising him throughout his life. And so I really like to sort of stop and talk about them. His indentured and his enslaved servants, all of their labor is actually what enabled him to gain the wealth and status that, allowed him to represent Suffolk County during the Continental Congress, during the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So while we often talk about William Floyd in a singular sort of way, he's this one history, this really important guy, the way we talk about a lot of the founding fathers, it's important to remember that there's actually this massive community of people that are behind him, this massive group of people that enable him, that allowed him to be exactly where he needed to be when it came time to sign and to declare independence. I really just think that's an incredible story. Later on in his life, William Floyd would actually not come back to Long Island. He visited every now and then. He actually hosted Thomas Jefferson at one point, very briefly. But he deeded the land to his son, and so the sort of generational passing went. William Floyd retired and passed away in upstate New York. There's another manor up there. It's actually built to look exactly like the William Floyd Estate in Mastic Beach, which is one of the fun facts about it. So he really liked the estate, but he was sort of tired of living on Long Island. His son actually inherited the property, kept the estate going for a really long time. Eventually, things would start to wane a little bit on the property. It became less of an agricultural spot, less of a plantation, as they sort of started to divest first off in plants, corn, oats, flax, wheat. They then started to divest from livestock, although they had livestock on the property that they were selling all the way up until the early 1900s. But over the course of the 1800s, you see the shift where this sort of generational wealth that is inherited by the children and grandchildren of William Floyd, especially because of his affluence and status, they sort of went off to school. Many of them became lawyers, doctors. They became very involved in the publishing industry in New York City. They also were very important in the whaling industry. As I mentioned before, they were sort of financial engines for the whaling industry in New York City. And so they sort of start to spread out. And, generations go by, more and more inheritors of that land sort of sell it off and allow it to become developed, allow it to become the neighborhoods that I grew up in. But the main part of the William Floyd estate sort of lived on. It was preserved by the family until it became basically a vacation home. So up until the late 1800s and the early 1900s, the family members, the descendants of William Floyd, sort of used it as a summer gathering space. They would come out from the city to cool down, relax, and enjoy themselves. When the war ended, William Floyd retired. Oh, Westernville is the spot that he retired to. That I was trying to remember a moment ago. So Nickel Floyd II actually inherited the land. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison came down. They were very interested in actually visiting Puspatuck at one point. Thomas Jefferson wanted to record words in the Native American and the Native Unkachog language. One of the words that he recorded was mastic, meaning running water. So for those of us who grew up in Mastic and Mastic Beach, that means running water in the native language. Over time, New York State would actually start to gradually abolish, or what was called gradually manumit slavery. It was, sort of obviously earlier than the Civil War. Gradual manumission was a little bit different from abolition. Gradual manumission said that instead of freeing all of the slaves, we would sort of phase out slavery over time. Many people who were born before a certain date would be given freedom at a certain age. And so as you saw, this sort of slave economy, especially on Long Island, wane into the early to mid late 1800s. This photograph I really love. I think this is one of the coolest photos we have in our collection. This is a photograph of a gentleman named Charles Murray. He was born on the estate in 1804 to an enslaved person and was indentured under the terms of gradual manumission until his 28th birthday when he was manumitted, when he was freed from slavery. He continued to live on the estate, working with the family until he passed away, we believe, in around 1898. So it's just nice to be able to look back and see the faces of some people, because he was sort of around when photography started to, at the beginning of our photographic collection on the property. The Floyds later condemned slavery. They sort of recognized the brutality of the institution and wanted to distance their family from that. One of the Floyds actually fought during the Civil War under the Union flag, but of course its legacy still remains today. A lot of that intergenerational wealth is still fueling later generations. And today, we're doing a lot of research at the William Floyd Estate, really trying to better understand the way that slavery happened here, to better really find these stories of the people who lived and worked here. And I've been lucky to hear some of these stories over time. Over time, the Floyds steadily sort of abandoned this property, abandoned farming, I should say, for careers in politics, laws, and science. They sort of sold off bits and pieces of the land. The plantation became this vacation spot Generations of Floyd spent their family, spent their summers with their family rummaging through the attic. And of course, many of the people who would have been enslaved on this property moved out into the neighborhood, and it's quite possible that their ancestors still live there today. Many of my neighbors, and of course, the Unkachog Nation is still in Mastic Beach at a spot called Puspatak. So from 1724 to 1976, 8 generations of William Floyd's, family lived at the old Mastic house. There are so many stories that, to tell all about this. So from the original 4,400 acres that was bought by Richard Floyd II and then settled by Nickel Floyd, about 613 remained at a spot called Home Neck that we saw on the map in the beginning. Cornelia Floyd, one of the latest descendants of the Floyd family actually to live on and own the property, decided that for the bicentennial of the United States in 1976, that she wanted to see the land preserved and see these stories told. And so she donated this small portion that remained of the William Floyd Estate to the National Park Service for preservation. And that's what we continue to do today. I hope you'll consider visiting the William Floyd Estate. There are so many stories to tell. There are so many bits of American history, stories from the Civil War, stories from the World Wars, stories from the 60s. There's just all of this really diverse history here on the property. Unfortunately, due to some critical work, like I mentioned before, that's being done mainly on the roof of the house and also on the interior collection, the house itself is closed. So whereas we used to take people on tours, right now we're not taking people on tours through the house. But you can take a tour through the grounds, join us on one of our ranger programs. We usually list those on our website, which is nps.gov/FIIS. That's for Fire Island. If you go to our event calendar, that's where we list all of the events. We usually have them up on a monthly basis. So maybe you'll come out, join a lecture, listen to some of our rangers, talk to me or one of the other park rangers about this rich history. And like I said, we barely scratched the surface over the course of this program. I just like to plug this really neat self-guided tour that you can do if you wanted to go on your own. There is a new app that the National Park Service put out, and as part of that launch, we put together this self-guided audio tour so you can walk around with your headphones in if you download this app. And it shows you all these little GPS plot points, and it tells this story, again, the story of multiple generations, multiple groups of people that really made the William Floyd Estate such a special and unique place. If you're not one for walking, I always tell people you can actually just do this on your couch. You don't need to be at the spot. You'll hear my voice talking to you all about the people who lived and worked on the property over time. So that is the official National Park Service app. If you go to that app, look up Fire Island, you'll see self-guided tours. If you go to self-guided tours, is the only one I have up right now. I'm working on some new ones, but that's just something I like to plug. So my name is Kelty. I work for Fire Island National Seashore, National Park Service under the U.S. Department of the Interior. I hope you guys had a good time.